With the Transparent Chennai team, and there's a whole bunch of us here if you want to raise your hands. That's us. We all came here from Chennai because we were very, very excited about this event. We are basically a group that uses maps and data in our work. We think of ourselves as a community planning organization, essentially using these tools to try and improve the ability of residents to make better claims on the government. The groups that we have been working with in Chennai have largely been groups of the poor. So what we thought we could do today, I hope y'all aren't leaving. Okay. Okay. So I thought what we could do today is very, very briefly just show about 5 images from one engagement that we did in a ward in Chennai, working with one area which is an undeclared slum, that is that residents don't have the right to be there. They don't have any tenure paperwork there. Show the data that we created and the process that we talk a little bit about the process that we used to make it, and also talk a little bit about the results that it had. The hope here is that we're talking about this data creation, mapping, etc., in a context, and that context was, you know, that something that Preeti will talk about. And afterwards, if we either have people from a neighborhood here or people who want to present their own problems, I thought maybe we could think about strategies of using data to make better claims on the government, and discuss those strategies in the group with us. Does that sound like a good plan? Yes? And that we could have some of the people who just presented, and Arun from yesterday, maybe give us their feedback, as well as the other members of the Transparent Chennai team who've used a wide variety of methods to actually brainstorm on ways that we could actually use these tools to actually make better claims on the government. Yeah? Is that fine with everyone? I'm getting no responses. Can you wave if it's okay? So I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Chennai and the history of our work. So basically, okay. I think Anand must have opened with something about data and meanings and uses of data. But what I wanted to talk about was a group in Chennai called Pen Urumai Iyakam, the women's rights movement. We do some work with the PI. And I think had some of us been born in an earlier era, maybe 40 years ago, we might have been members of PI ourselves. And so that's why I want to talk about them today. So basically the history of PI is this. There was some young professionals who came together, I think, who were very motivated young women. There was a professor who's now a head of department in Atiraj College. There's now a woman who's a judge, a high court judge in Madras. There were lawyers, there were teachers, there were even people who studied mathematics. And they came together and they decided to start a women's movement. So that's how the PI was born. And basically they started meeting on Fridays to discuss women's issues. So they would have a kind of a sit down, and women from local communities would come and bring their problems, like if they had domestic violence problems, or if they had, you know, issues with dowry or issues with their mother-in-law, or they faced harassment. They would bring those problems to PI, and these women would sit and kind of adjudicate, right? And with their moral authority would support these women, the community women who are coming to them with problems, to resolve their problems, right? So if there was a problem in their marriage, they would say, okay, we think that this is a problem, and then the husband would hopefully listen to the woman. And as time went on, it turned out that a lot of the problems that the women were facing were not just within the home. They were a product of the place that they lived in, because a lot of them were actually slum women. So then on Saturdays, they started doing slum work, because it turned out that, you know, they didn't have access to water, they didn't have access to tenure rights, they didn't have access to a toilet. And from this, the work of PI actually changed from this group of largely young professional women to a group that was working on slum rights, right, more broadly speaking. Always with a women's focus, but really looking at the issue of slum rights. And by the mid-1980s, PI was the kind of the focal point of one of the largest and most effective housing rights movements in the city of Chennai, for sure. And actually, I think across many cities in India, I haven't seen a group this effective and a movement this effective in the past. And over time, the leadership of the movement also changed. From these young professionals to actually being led by these women from the slums. And I want to talk about that today, because I think as we are talking about data and advocacy and different ways of impacting the state, right, of doing advocacy, of changing our cities, I also want to think about the institutional structures within which we're doing it. Unfortunately, even though I started the Transparent Chennai project, this is something of our design, we all created it together. I don't see a future in which a transformation like what happened to PI happening to our own group, right? And I think that's partly because of the methods that we use, right? Because we use things like mapping, we use things like data, we focus on research as a means of changing the city. It's very unlikely that people from slums will themselves come and take over this work. And we're also housed within an academic institution, and so you have to have a degree in order to become a candidate for a job here. So there's a lot of institutional structures that we've put into place within our group, and I think this is common to many other people who are using these methods across cities in India, and have created institutions which may not be able to become of the slums themselves. And I think that's an important thing to just think about as we are moving forward with this very exciting discussion about data in the city. And the second thing that I wanted to talk about is the difference between the work that PI does and the work that we do. The difference is that the language that PI used is explicitly political, right? It's a language of, of politics. They're dealing with politicians. They're talking to politicians every day. We are dealing with bureaucrats. We deal with data. We deal with things that are explicitly unpolitical. And I don't know what that means for our work, and I don't know what that means for the success of our work. But one of the things that I was hoping that we could do at this meeting, along with all of you, was to try and think about how this language, the language of data, of mapping, of this new concern with cities, could also be injected with a more explicit politics, right? One that I think we can all agree on. We all anyway work on these issues together, and I think we all share a same set of values. But one that could also help us to grow the audience for this beyond just this room, and really have the reach and the impact of what a PI had in the 70s and the 80s.
So hi, since this is a session on accountability, I'd like to talk about one of our exercises that had to do with creating data and starting conversations on accountability at a ward level. And this is something that we call the ward accountability experiment. What we hope to do is to create data at a ward level. Usually, if we are faced with some issue, we usually just say, oh, there's a huge garbage pile right outside my house. Why don't I call the councillor and get him to address it, right? But we wanted to create data that would enable citizens to understand their whole ward in a sense of what are the issues that are plaguing the ward and what is the state of sort of infrastructure that exists in the ward, right? I mean, wards have a lot of infrastructure that are meant to benefit the public, including public toilets, but we often don't know whether they're functional and how we can address those issues and so forth. So I think one of the main aims of the ward accountability experiment was to create data on a sort of ward level so that A, citizens can understand their wards better, and B, to provide spatial information to the councillor about what problems exist and which areas are most in need of sort of priority interventions. And that was the basic those were the goals of the ward accountability experiment. What it also helps you do is, if you were to do this sort of exercise periodically, you would be able to gauge the performance of a councillor. Say that when we started out, when we created this data, there were all these problems, but over time, after bringing these issues to light in this manner, how the councillor has been able to address those issues. But these maps serve as a starting point for conversation, which I'll get into soon. I think we could briefly talk about how this exercise started. We had done a pilot in one ward, after which the findings of the mapping exercise were presented. at a meeting right ahead of the elections. So all the candidates who were running for councillor were able to make promises to the public about, addressing these issues if they were to be voted into power. Later, I think we were approached by an organization that wanted to study sort of inequities within a ward, right? They wanted to see, which parts of the ward fared worse off in terms of sort of quality of infrastructure and in terms of the issues that they were facing, which is when we started the exercise in Ward 57. What we did is we set out with a bunch of volunteers and collected information on certain things in the ward. We were concerned with where garbage most piled up in the ward, so we mapped on paper maps the location of garbage piles by their size. As you can see in this map, we were concerned with large, medium, and small trash sites, as well as where construction debris got collected. Right? We also collected information on the location and the functionality of public toilets. And public toilets were, I think, public toilets were, I think the functionality of a public toilet was determined on the basis of, whether there was enough light, whether there were doors, whether there was water, and whether it was sort of clean enough for somebody to use. And we also mapped the location and functionality of water points, of like common water points, whether those pumps actually worked, what water supply was like, and so forth. So we actually, about 10 of us set out on foot, went street by street and mapped this data on paper maps, which was then sort of taken back to the office. Prabhu is our technical lead here, who helps us convert data collected on paper maps onto a digital format. And this is what the garbage data looked like to begin with, right? So you have all these points with information on on the size, right? So
red is large trash, and the yellow is medium trash, and the green is small trash.
Trash on the street. Yeah, this ward did have a huge sort of garbage problem. This is one of the older parts of town with really narrow streets. They had a huge problem with garbage collection and so forth. This is Roypuram. This is in the north of Madras. On public toilets, we knew whether there were facilities only for men and women or not, and whether these toilets were functional. I think one thing that this sort of exercise helped us do was to, we gained a lot of insights from something like this. For instance, that garbage map with points was then sort of made into a heat map that showed you the areas that most needed intervention for that particular issue. And this is a zoomed in part of the low-income neighborhood of the ward that was located closest to a canal, right? And they faced the largest garbage problem in the ward. And this is something that spatial data at a ward level could show us. Right? And I think other insights were that there were fewer toilets for women as against men as far as the whole ward was concerned. A lot of the common water points in low-income neighborhoods were not functional. And these are the sort of populations that are most dependent on common water sources. So I think that when data was collected at the ward level, it revealed to us a lot about the poor state of services within low-income neighborhoods in specific. So what we thought was that, this is a great sort of starting point for what could potentially be a continuing conversation on access to services in the ward. We took this to the councillor, and he's great. He had never received data like this before. He had never received a sort of overall spatial picture of the ward. And he said, all right, this is telling us a lot of things, and I'm willing to sort of take this forward in a way that you see fit. And so what we did was we had a huge public meeting with members of the residents from the low-income neighborhoods of the ward and the councillor, where we presented the maps to the people with the councillor present, and we encouraged the people to sort of, start talking about the issues that most affect them in their everyday lives. And then the maps just became a sort of trigger for further conversation, and the people started to come up with all the issues that they've been facing. They revealed to us a lot of things, such as that garbage that had been piled up along the canal had not been cleared for like 30 years at that point, right? So there was just accumulation of garbage that was leading to like really poor conditions within the neighborhoods and so forth. But what we did at the end of that meeting was that we agreed to meet once every month, so that the issues faced by the people could be discussed at a forum at which the councillor was also present. And after that, we have, I think, so far succeeded with holding how many? 7 meetings at which we've had the councillor and the people come, and with people raising their concerns and the councillor also having a sort of chance to respond and be able to address these issues. So every month we're able to see if he's addressed the issues of the past month. It also gives them an opportunity to explain the difficulties that arise in sort of getting something done. Some things are easily fixed as opposed to others. I think one thing that the people wanted was sort of speed breakers on the main road so that, you know, accidents can be reduced, but that's not something he's been able to achieve very quickly because it is involved, you know, permissions from many departments and so forth. So it's also been a chance for him to respond to the people about, you know, what are the things that can be done. But I think the effects have been visibly better. The people have received a lot of service. Like, for instance, new roads were laid. They now have an underground drainage connection. A toilet in the area was completely refurbished and made usable, and so forth as a result of these interactions. And the garbage problem. We've succeeded in setting up a sort of garbage collection system by which the problem has been considerably reduced. The councillors also addressed the accumulation of garbage near the canal. So we feel that maps in this particular exercise were like a great tool of advocacy to sort of start, you know, conversations on issues at a local level. It has also helped that the council has been very responsive. So maps have been a tool to ensure municipal accountability in this case. But this isn't the only sort of thing that we do. We usually, any exercise like this is sort of situated against the larger landscape of, you know, the research that we are doing on governance, on slums, on access to services, and so forth. We also create maps for other purposes. One thing that I can think of that we did was the city was planning to open new shelters for the homeless, additional shelters, but had no idea as to where to locate them. Also, ahead of an enumeration of the homeless in the city, we needed to get a sense of, you know, where they can be found and so forth. So we did what we call a sort of preliminary mapping of the locations of homeless clusters in the city. And this we did using sort of local knowledge, the knowledge that local NGOs possess in terms of, you know, where the homeless, and the people who participated in the exercise also belong to homeless communities. So we got a lot of the tacit knowledge that rests with people was then sort of, we tried to draw that and sort of make that visible on a paper map that was then digitized, and then, you know, we could, in a similar fashion, also prioritize areas where shelters were most needed and so forth. And these maps have been a great advocacy tool in terms of sort of locating these shelters and so forth.
Municipality wanted to plan for toilets, but they didn't have a map of their existing toilets. So one thing we did was we called all the junior engineers who work at the ward level into office and asked them to actually map all the existing toilets and all the toilets they would like to propose. And just through this exercise, the conversations they had were really interesting because they were now planning where exactly to situate a new toilet, how far away it should be from an existing toilet, whether it would be near a TASMAC shop, which is where, which is the government's authorized, it's an authorized reseller of alcohol in Tamil Nadu. So these are discussions that they were actually having while planning these proposed toilets. So we use this mapping exercise to support a planning initiative for the city.
Could somehow workshop a couple of ideas, maybe select a problem or an area, and then think of ways in which these kinds of tools could be used within a context to address a particular issue, or we could discuss some of the issues that you may face in using these kinds of tools to address that issue.
Initially, first when we started off, we used Google Earth as a tool. We take a screenshot of the Google Earth images. We tried with the walking papers and field papers as well. The problem we faced is mainly we work with a slum area where we couldn't the satellite image which we are getting through the walking paper and field paper, it's not that much good in the slum areas. So we couldn't use that because like mainly we wanted to stick with the walking paper and field paper is like it's completely open. The Google Earth, this is not completely open. It's as far as like we are using with NGO purpose, it's okay. But we cannot claim that it's a completely open. That's why we try to use with the walking paper and field paper, but we couldn't. So then we print out that Google Earth images, and we like while printing those map, we'll make sure that we are getting the reference points. So which area we are printing out. Then initially like we'll distribute those paper mapping to all the volunteers. They'll mark the points on the map. Then while coming back, we using that reference point, we initially did the, using the Google Earth itself, the image overlay. There is one function called image overlay in Google Earth. But it's very complicated to align it properly. So then using that, then we converted into the quantum GIS where you can use the georeferencing, the image georeferencing. Using that we did it. So once we overlaid on top of that, we can like just mark those points and digitize all the data. Well, they usually like mark all the points in the paper map and they make sure they are noting down all the data in a separate sheet. So we link it together. This is how we made this process.
Sort of visibly where garbage most accumulated at a certain point. We didn't really do rounds of sort of garbage collection. We didn't collect that data. We were interested more in terms of indicators of where garbage sort of accumulated.
Initially, what the data did was to support residents' beliefs that the councillor ignored their area because they had not supported him in the election, right? But what the data then ended up doing was providing a basis on which the councillor was able to prioritize interventions kind of in a rational way, right? And he himself was able to use this to speak to junior engineers and other people that he needed to get the work done in the ward, right? So it served as a tool for him as well. So I think that was very interesting. And also managed to kind of serve as a leverage point to change the way in which that kind of the given story or the given political condition of the ward was thought about and represented by people. So now I wanted to invite Dunu to say a few words on, I think, his thoughts on this, given that the Hazard Center has been working in this area for far, far longer than we have.
I think the 2 points were, one of them you've made and one of them you've made. They're very important. The first point is the context in which this is situated. See, if the context is, for instance, privatization of waste, which means that you turn everything over to the private company, then there's a memorandum of agreement that is signed between the municipality and the private company. It's a PPP mode. And in that PPP mode, basically what they get are tipping charges, which means the maximum amount that they can collect gets put onto the truck and it gets taken to the landfill and they're paid by tonnage. Which means that it doesn't matter whether it's garbage or not garbage. Whatever is lying, whether it is of value or not of value, will get taken up and be dumped into the landfill. And in fact, it makes the landfill problem worse because you suddenly need more acres of land to fill in the land, to dump that garbage. That's one point. And therefore, context becomes extremely important as to what is happening overall in the city. That's one point. And the second point that you've made, actually, if you look at garbage from the point of view of the garbage collector, you get a completely different map. You don't get a map of this kind at all. And it's a very fascinating map that comes out as to where they collect, where they take, where they sort out, segregate, recycle. So you're looking at a chain. You're not looking just at my garbage, it should disappear. Nothing ever disappears. It's got to go somewhere. So these 2 aspects, if one keeps in mind, I think qualitatively as well as quantitatively, the picture begins to change.
You mentioned 2 points to think about, one of which was how does this effort become owned or taken over by the people you are actually doing it for. Would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. I mean, not just posing the question. I'm not looking for an answer, but just your thoughts.
This is something that we're grappling with as far as this particular award is concerned. We've created the first set of maps. We've had 7 meetings. But we find ourselves being the sort of initiative takers of this exercise every month. And that's something that we want to change. We want to change the fact that, that it takes initiative from our side to keep an ongoing sort of conversation, to sustain such a conversation, basically. And that's something that we're trying to do now, which is to sort of hand the process back over to the community and say, you know, these are issues that concern you, and we only sort of help create the data that could start a conversation like this, but in order to sustain that, you know, that the efforts must come from below is something that we're trying to do now. And yeah, progress on that has been fairly slow so far. We've...
For example, in this homelessness issue, we didn't instigate that work. And even in the Ward 57, we didn't instigate it. We were invited there by an NGO. So I think in the homelessness work, what happened was a group of organizations of the homeless and working with the homeless that were trying to impact the government said, oh, we saw your maps at a meeting. Can you make one for us on homelessness? Right? And so I think that's the role that we want to play, right? We want to just like support existing claim making on the government. But sometimes what ends up happening is because these tools are so new, we end up kind of stoking the fire, right? This question I posed earlier was also somewhat bigger, which is, are these actually taking over existing ways of claim making on the government? The kind of the road rocos and the other things. And if so, I think it's more problematic, and that's I think something worth thinking about, and how we can prevent it from being taken over in a way that's really exclusive, right? If it's being taken over, then it should be a kind of, can it be something that's more inclusive, that's added to an arsenal of existing political kind of methodologies or whatever?
There's this one about homelessness. Look at context. The context is an NGO wants to put homeless into night shelters.
No, not quite.
It's a homeless campaign that's going on. So the identities of homeless, mapping homeless, and then seeing what to do about it. If you talk to the homeless, they don't regard themselves as homeless. They regard themselves as workers. So which identity do you pick up? You pick up homeless identity or you pick up worker identity. And if you take up different identities, actually the trajectory begins to change. Whether you're looking at night shelters or whether you're looking at livelihoods. This context, I think, is so important, so important. I mean, I'll give you another example of, say, sewerage workers. Sewerage workers routinely in cities across the world get into sewers to unclog them. And there have been various attempts to mechanize it. It's failed because the sewer system is not designed for current sewerage. The current sewerage carries plastics, STs, tampons, acids, all kinds of things for which sewers were never designed. So that's why sewer workers have to get in, actually, you know, they have to get into the shit. They immerse themselves in the shit and then they unclog the drain. Now, if you talk to sewerage workers, they want relief. They don't want to get into the sewers to do this kind of work. But then what is the solution? If you talk to Dalit leaders, what they will say, we don't, and because this is work that Dalits do. That's the only occupation that many Dalit groups will get. So if you talk to Dalit leaders, they will say that Dalits must get into social mobility. They must get out of this work. This is dirty work, nobody should do it. The moment you say nobody should do it, actually the city is in for a problem. Because it means that the shit is going to get clogged up. And on the other hand, if the Dalit leader says that nobody should do it, Dalits get into a problem because there's no other livelihood. And how do you negotiate this terrain? Right? So this is tricky, and that's why I keep urging that one needs to look a little beyond the immediate problem to understand the context, because if one doesn't understand context, one tends to drive the agenda on the basis of what one believes. You know, every one of us has certain beliefs. And you drive the agenda because you think that because I need this, therefore people need it, which may not be true.
It was again a study that people got together and did in Delhi on homeless workers. And why I'm saying it's homeless workers, because the study was actually on labor chalks. But it showed that 80% of the workers were actually homeless. So the connection between livelihoods and homelessness was very clear, and therefore the mapping exercise that's taken up in such situations. So, for example, the Construction Workers and Construction and Other Building Workers Act says that there should be a shelter for workers to rest, and they should be provided with all the basic services, first aid, water, sanitation, everything. But on the other hand, homeless, if we look into the norms that are being propagated by the government for homeless, it says that, and some of us were here discussing it yesterday also, that for every 1 lakh population, and this applies to the entire country, right? For every 1 lakh population, you have one shelter. And I'm sure whoever, like all of us who must have tried to engage with this problem, have realized that the shelters are not housing the homeless. So then, how do we also integrate the demand for adequate housing, which we also try and talk about? We don't want homeless to be restricted to shelters. We obviously, and I think Chennai has, recently I've heard that Chennai has some interesting programs where after 6 months or a year, they try and shift people into better housing, whether it's rental or whatever, but apparently some new shelters have opened, they're multi-storied shelters and much more like cleaner and everything from Delhi and other cities. But the fact is it's still like within the same paradigm that we're stuck in. So how do we start drawing these linkages and therefore making these maps more explosive? Thank you.
This is Arvind, and I'm representing a NGO called YUVA. And so what I think, and YUVA is a very grassroots-based organization, and we are those Rasta Roko and Jhanda Leke Jane Wala types people. And this mapping exercise has been very new to us. And we are right now engaged in the development plan revision process that's happening in Mumbai. And so it's just been, I think, 2 years that we have engaged in mapping and map making processes, and how to, and we are kind of still developing ways of how to use those maps as advocacy documents and to present our case in a better way. So the problems that we are probably having right now is that one, which you are having, is that how to engage the bigger, the public or the community that we are working with, because we generally work with the urban poor. So that is a major issue. Because, and actually it's easier for us because we are not really proper mappers or planners or anything. I am an architect, but we are trying for mechanisms where we can have trainings. We are doing trainings, and we are doing community mappings. We are trying to have this strong team of, I don't know, probably approximately 20 odd people who would take care of their wards and who would do trainings to other communities in their wards where they are strong. We are engaging with NGOs in an attempt to, NGOs and these so-called trainers that we have, who read maps, who understand how the development plan process happens. And then we are in the process of making a guide or a handbook of how the DP thing works, what colors mean what, and how that might happen. DP is the development plan, the master plan, the city plan, how that works, and we hope that once that is done, can that document be passed on, and rather than a few NGOs and CBOs coming together and 50 odd people, this becomes a bigger sort of movement, if it's possible. So that is one thing that we are trying to do. The second is, my request would be to the mappers and the hackers and all the tech people, that we have lots of maps right now. We have lots of maps because our DP revision process and our arguments of how much of development plan was implemented, what was the percentage land that got developed, is all in a sort of in actual sheets and papers, reports. And there are these new demands from different sectors, like the homeless workers in Mumbai, the Adivasi Padas, the marginalized and the most invisible communities in the city. So because we don't have this sort of a lot of time, because the development plan is this process that's being headed by the BMC, and we have to intervene in very quick manner. We are making a lot of maps, making a lot of information, but somehow that's not there for people to view in a very clear manner. So my request is that if there is any way to put that thing on there, on the web or on any space where the city starts to come in and city starts to, make the data more comprehensive. That is one place where we're really struggling. So I thought I'll just give my feedback and my experience on the thing.
So there are a lot of requests which I hear of, putting data on the map and putting them on the web, but that's not an end in itself, of course. There are so many projects which have put maps on the net and hoping that crowdsourcing will, make the data more comprehensive and people will use it, but that doesn't ever happen. Like you mentioned the Dedu Shahidi projects and stuff like that. So any experience from your side, maybe you're going to talk about it today sometime in the course of time as to, how that has gone ahead in your experiences, be it Wiki, be it anywhere else, as to how to ensure that people are actually using them and something's coming out of them.
Can I make a suggestion? So I was told a few minutes ago, but I kind of ignored him, that we should go and drink some coffee. So there's coffee and snacks. Do people want?
So just to tell what we are doing, we are participating for the urban poor in the development plan revision process that's being done by the Municipal Corporation, the BMC. What we want to do is that we just want to ensure that the process is participatory, and there are a lot of benefits of having a development plan recognize you, give you reservations, give you sort of things that you require in your neighborhood, like a park, like a health center, like a dispensary, like a very good school, which probably at a later day would be developed into the said amenities. So that is what a development plan does. But right now, what is there in Mumbai is that you see so many slums, and some of the slums cannot be developed because they are on open space reservation, or they are on some other reservation. And the duration of this development plan is of 20 years, which basically means that you have to either change the development plan, which is a very complicated process, and usually it doesn't really happen, and what it leads to is unplanned, non-implemented development plans, and what it gives you is Mumbai, which is in which 50% of the population lives in informal settlements, and lots of other things. But development plan is not the only thing that governs how the city grows or develops, but it's one of the major plans that affect the urban poor in the city.
So the problem is that you want urban poor groups to be better recognized in the new development plan that's being written for the city of Bombay, right? And you're trying to find tools that can help YUVA do that better, right? Okay. Yes? So the problem is clear. So do we want questions are there questions for Arvind?
So they have SRA models in Mumbai and the Slum Regulation Authority. Yeah, and they don't recognize these slums, is what you're trying to say, or informal settlements?
It's a policy that has come about in Mumbai, and what it basically does is that if there is this big patch of informal settlement and there are X number of clauses, by which the settlement is or can be developed under SRA. That again, there are like very exclusionary clauses in the first place. Then what happens is that you put that informal settlement into hardly 1/4 of that plot, and you put them in very small houses basically, which is not the right model. So SRA is very different from this development plan process. And we are not really happy with the SRA, because SRA, when it started, the demand was SRA is completely different from the development plan process.
Can you just briefly go through who are the major players in this process and how you have gone about sort of influencing them so far, and what their, if you know, separate motivations could possibly be?
State is something that in the end approves this development plan. So Urban Development Department, Maharashtra, and the state government, because it's our chief minister who's the head of UDD. So they are also major players, and since Bombay is such an important future world-class city that they imagine it to be, so all the eyes are there, and whatever policies generally emanate from Bombay would at a later day influence the other policies in urban centers. And what we have done, the first space where we got some scope of participation was in this development plan process. There are like 10 steps that they have to follow. And the second major one is where they do the existing land use survey. So in the existing land use survey, we are a grassroots organization, and we are very strong in one ward where we do our groundwork. And what we did was that basically challenged this notion of them mapping 1.25 or 35 crore people, or 430-50 odd kilometers, using just 25 people and doing that in 6 months. And not involving any of the citizenry, the people who are actually most impacted by this development plan. So that notion of a GIS or a very sophisticated mechanism that they use, whatever they used, to challenge that was very important for us. And what we did initially was to compare the existing land use survey that they did to the actual situations on the ground. And then only we could come out with, we went there on the ground. We went there on the ground. So you looked at their maps with our groundwork coupled with Google Earth. So we took all these things, and then we went on the ground and then showed that, okay, you have not mapped this informal settlement. This informal settlement is of 600 odd hutments, which basically means 3,000 odd people. They're not there in the map. And there are these fishing villages that have been marked wrongly. Their urban commons are not there, marked as vacant land. Lot of issues. Adivasi padas, they don't exist. So such huge problems came about. And then what we thought was that we network with other people. We network with other NGOs, CBOs. And then of the 24 wards, we covered about 8 wards in Bombay. So which is 1/3, and considering the last four ones are not really our territory, the sort of Fort and the Nariman Point and the Marine Drive area, which we are not really concerned with. So we managed to cover a substantial number of wards, about 50% of Mumbai, and we came about with 1,200 odd errors. And then we reported that to the BMC, and then they kind of acknowledged, okay, there is some problem in the way that we have gone about with the mapping. And they also recognize, okay, there are some mistakes and we're willing to correct them. And then they uploaded the maps on the website. They displayed the maps in the ward offices. And some sort of windows opened up for participation. So that came about after a lot of NGOs came together, a lot of groundwork was done. Google Earth maps were compared with the existing land use plus the groundwork. So that was the process that we initiated the whole thing. And now we have gone to the next stage where we are not just limiting ourselves to the existing land use and just point out mistakes in the survey that they did, but we again have come together in the form of a bigger campaign called Hamara Shehar, Hamara Vikas, Hamara Niyojan. And in that, we are raising demands that we are so many people, we require so many X number of facilities based on so-and-so standards. So that is something that we are doing right now. And the recent thing that we are doing is that we have selected a pocket of about 3.5 lakh people, and we're actually engaging in a process of sort of participatory planning, where we have focus group discussions, where people are engaged in locating their amenities, they're telling us where the survey has gone wrong, and whatever technical things that we can use, like apps and things that say that, okay, this is the geo, basically, which gives us the GIS coordinates, everything. So that we are using, and trying to give a model to the BMC, saying that this is how you should actually go about with the no, the problem is that there are so many layers, so many data that we have collected, and that needs to be developed or generated to counter what the BMC is doing. And the only way to counter is to come up with your data. It might be wrong, it might be correct, it might be bad, it might not be accurate, whatever it is, but there has to be something by which we counter that. And okay, best example would be of, let's say, Adivasi Padas in Bombay. So right now we are doing this, Adivasi Padas are tribal settlements in Bombay. So we are doing this mapping exercise with them right now, where we call the community heads, the unions and the Sangatans and the CBOs in the Adivasi Padas. They come to our office, we do it using Google Earth, Photoshop, and all the maps, and then we do a sort of patchy job. But it is not really where the community is empowered. It's not really where the maps are visible to everyone. It's not where someone sitting in some other Adivasi Pada logs onto the net and then he adds to that. That's not possible. And like you said, the structures that we have created are sometimes the hindrances that we are facing right now. So we are attempting to create these training modules very specifically to the development plan and not other things, because it would be a very vast thing. But still we feel that somewhere this content that we have prepared, the maps, the layers that we have prepared, and that we need to prepare in future, have to be there, visible for people to add on to comment, to take it to the next level, if that's possible, and not like the 1,200 things that you said, they are not used or they're shut.
That's a good thing for the settlement. It may not always be, right? In your overall context, it seems like it seems that it's very important to create this data because you need the data to challenge the mainstream discourse about what the city looks like, right? And what needs to be done to the city. So overall, it seems quite a valid ground to do that. But then again, it's important to not only, so map does not only empower people when one gets to at least see the map, but I think especially when you're creating data about people's lives, it's important that the people about whom you're creating the data, they have a say in terms of how this data is traveling in the city. And Mumbai especially has a very problematic history of number of NGOs who has worked in slums, who has created extensive data about slums, and how that data has traveled into governmental circuits and has allowed for creation of plans that has not necessarily gone in the favor of the slum dwellers, right? And I'm not naming names because I guess you know them all. So I think that is a very serious problem to address at the very beginning. We keep talking about the fact that Google doesn't have a very democratic data policy. The NGOs should have at least a data policy regarding what they would allow people to do with the data and what not they would allow people to do. In what form they would be willing to share the data with other people, other NGOs working in the field, in what form they would be sharing the data with the government. And I think if you're undertaking such a large-scale data collection process, it might not be a very legally standard text that you come up with, but at least principles. And I think that's definitely a step towards being at least more open to the possibility of what dangers data might bring, right? That said, I think it would be useful to go back to the 3 questions we were thinking about yesterday. So what maps you want to give out to people, you want to share with people, for whom it's meant, and what you expect to happen when the people for whom it's meant gets the maps. And that would possibly allow us to think through more systematically in terms of how to create a system that does these things.
Thank you. Making a map in itself is not an end. You know, and I think as the previous commenter mentioned, I could understand that you want to challenge BMC's data, but I couldn't really understand what your end goal finally was. Or if we know that, maybe people can actually, you know, give better suggestions. And my question was, so are you looking for a crowdsourced platform where you want comments and things to come from different people and many people to watch or see your map? Is that what you're looking at?
I would suggest that maybe you can answer those 3 questions. What maps, for whom it's meant, and what should happen, and for this particular exercise.
For what the comment that you said, this same question has been raised in many platforms, and we have been responding to it again and again. There are NGOs, there are people who use data to lobby for themselves, and then they say that we have a lot of data, we have access to this community, and we are the right people that you should ally with, and they have their interests, and that's happened in Bombay, that has happened everywhere. I mean, we have to differentiate ourselves from that, and the communities that we work in, right now they are in a lot of trouble, not trouble, but they have this daily battle that happens, which is partly in some way related to the fact that they are not there in the official maps. And our people, the urban poor, have to deal with 115 documents or 10 odd documents which say that you live there, you were from here, and you were here before 1995, post 1995, you have a ration card, you have Aadhaar card, you have 15, 20 documents. We know that development plan is just one of them.
What might happen is that we'll be able to think about this issue that Sumandro mentioned of the problems of bringing this data to light in the context of that particular map that you're talking about. So maybe we can start by looking at the specifics rather than the general, yeah?
Okay, I think I would start with his question and might probably answer yours. So mapping was just this small exercise before we generated our demands. And mapping was one exercise where we got that space or window which is not there in this formal process of DP, development plan making process. There is no formal window. For us to enter into this whole process, we had to show that, okay, there are some errors and participation is a required process. So right now, what we're doing is that we have created sort of demands, our demands, and what we hope from the city or what should the development plan address in our city. So that is something that's happening on the site. It's just not ending by ensuring that our settlements are there on the maps, which is, yes, very important. But then we are creating our own demands, and now we are creating a model, participatory model plan, which based upon this vision that we had created and the standards, not standards, but guidelines that we had created, we are making this model plan that we want to show to the BMC, saying that this is how it should be done, and this is how planning should be done, and you accept this patch of ours as the coming development plan, which would kind of ensure that enough public housing is kept for the poor in those areas, enough rental housing is there, n number of facilities.
As a result of this is that the development plan should make appropriate allocations for the urban poor in terms of housing, land, basic services and things like that.
Exactly.
Okay. And it's meant for who?
So that is a very tricky question. Once that map comes
So what I was meaning is not the map that you're talking about, but you also say that you have a lot of data, a lot of geodata, a lot of social data, and so on, and you would require some overall help in terms of thinking through how to make these data more accessible to people at large, right? So let's talk about the maps you haven't created already, and say you want to have to discuss a hypothetical map that you want to create. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about which map you want to create for whom and what you want to achieve by that.
Okay, let's say that we have not done the Adivasi Padas right now, and there are 222 odd Adivasi Padas, and they are mostly remotely located, not accessible, not mapped. Communities don't have any sort of entitlements. There is no electricity, there is no water, and lots of other issues. So our aim is to ensure that the ELU and the consequent DP plan that comes on the basis of the ELU has all these padas, shows their prime activity areas, the land that they use for agriculture, for their other sort of urban, the common land that they use, that the villages use, they have to be mapped. So if it's a possibility that we have this somewhere online, and someone wants to add to this layer of Adivasi Padas or to the urban commons, is it a possibility that someone can do it? Someone can do it at their own leisure, at their own place, and not come to YUVA or to other leading sort of NGOs who are right now in this development plan process. So that can have other implications also, but there is demand from the community, there is demand from the BMC also, because they don't have the data right now. And our thing is that even if it's wrong data, even if the boundaries are not correct, even if a couple of acres of urban common land is missed, but we have to come out with something so that they get their dues in the development plan. And so that is what our take is.
Just a comment on this crowdsourcing of this community. One, I think we should kind of let that go for a bit and say if we put it online and people will crowdsource, that's a good thing. But it doesn't seem to be in the best interest or really serving the community to just have random people. It seems like we should actually involve them and the communities of Bombay to say these people are here, they are an actual part of the city, they're not being acknowledged. Come to this place, meet these people, and help us kind of acknowledge their existence. I don't know if that's correct, but it feels like if it's online somewhere, you're missing an opportunity. They just want to be included, and being included in a DP plan is being included in a map, and also acknowledging that you play an important role in doing that. Don't just skip to the technology part. That is really important to me. Like, I would actually want to come to Bombay and say, I didn't even know there were people, these communities existed, right? So that's kind of one comment I sort of.
The kinds of data that can be crowdsourced as versus those that can't. For instance, I feel like everyone has a stake in public infrastructure. Like, I'm interested in a public toilet, everyone else is interested in it. There's no particular person's sort of stake on something like that, and it's infrastructure that already exists, that needs to be improved and so forth. And I think that kind of data can be crowdsourced because sort of everyone has a stake in it. It's so evidently for the betterment of that particular piece of infrastructure, but that's not necessarily true for locations and sizes of communities. I cannot claim an interest in them in sort of their welfare, but want to put things on the map that are probably better off outside of it, probably. That's one comment that I had. And the other is that I agree in that consent is a very problematic thing, and we've seen that consent is problematic even at the level of a slum. Like, even within a slum, you would have different people wanting different things, and consent building is a large part of sort of mapping exercises, especially if you want to do counter mapping initiatives. And we've had a lot of trouble getting consent from even a single community. So I think one thing to do would be to undertake counter mapping exercises at a community level after spending a lot of effort getting consent, instead of going on like a citywide exercise to locate all the sort of points may be a useful way to look at this. Also easier practically simply because you will not run into trouble later after having cultivated consent, or to see if that demand even exists from a particular sort of community.
Perhaps there's a process that needs to be taken into account. Just to give an example, in Delhi, 2002, the new master plan was coming. And when the master plan was coming, they put it up, the draft one, and asked for public comments. Now, in the public comments, there were several meetings that were held right through the city where people just wanted to know about the master plan. Nobody knew what the master plan was. So I think we had about 400 meetings just in Delhi alone, just explaining what the master plan was. Now, once the master plan comes up there as bullet points or as maps or as text, then people start getting interested. And one thing that came off that was, in some senses, one NGO got interested. There was crowdsourcing of data for homeless. And they counted 57,000 homeless on the streets. Now that, when it comes to how do you intervene in the master plan. So there were 13,000 signatures that were obtained from homeless people that went into the master plan authority saying, where's the space for homeless in your master plan? There's nothing. There's no provision. So you immediately run into a policy norm. Is there a norm for homeless or not? And for the first time, that master plan in Delhi came up with this norm that for every 1 lakh population, there has to be a night shelter. And that is now being used in cities across just that 13,000 signatures. But you know, what happens subsequently is even more interesting. Because what the administration does now is they have now set up homeless shelters, so-called, all over the city, but it depends on where there's a vacant building available. It is not dependent on where the homeless want a shelter. So now the data that was collected that time, 57,000 homeless on the streets, is being disaggregated to see who's where. Because the homeless are not just homeless. You hold meetings with them, they say, we work here. That's why we are staying on the pavement here. It's not that we don't have a home, say, in our village or somewhere else. We are here because we have to ply our trade. And because there's no shelter, that's why we are on the pavements. Now that means that now the map has to start showing not only shelters, but shelters with reference to work. And that's where then people start getting interested in where am I on this map? And is there a nearby shelter or not? If the shelter is too far away, it may be meeting that norm of 1 night shelter per 1 lakh, but it's meaningless. So I think these steps, sequential steps of data building into policy and people becoming aware of how to use that data then. There's one other very simple one, which is a lot of slums get evicted because they are so-called on the right of way. There's a rule that anybody on the right of way will get evicted and will not be liable to resettlement. Otherwise, they are liable to resettlement with these cut-off dates and so on. And that is where Google Earth becomes actually very useful. Because Google Earth, you can go back 10, 15 years and see the location where that slum was. Is there a road there at that time or not? And if the road is not there, that means that the road came later. So the right of way comes later and the slum comes earlier. So then there's a contestation possible, that we were on the map before the road was there. So should the road have the right of way or should we have the right of way? And I think therefore one needs to think these things through sequentially, step by step, of how you get into policy issues and how you get into local issues.
Okay, so we are running up close to the end of our time, but in the few minutes that we have left, what I'd like to do is to invite either Kaustubh and Sajjad to maybe give some suggestions, or anyone else, I mean not just them, in terms of how this problem that he's facing of how to make visible these Adivasi communities in Bombay can be addressed. And maybe what we could do is think through what might be some of the problems that emerge, like the ones that Nisha and Preeti and Dunu have brought up. Does that make sense? And also Sumandro from earlier. So can I have either of you, both of you, maybe suggest a strategy or two?
I'll try taking a stab on it. Just a sort of a reading, like a reference thing that might be interesting for people. One of the largest slum mapping, infrastructure mapping project that I've heard about and been known all the people who did that is called Map Kibera. The website's mapkibera.org. Kibera is the largest slum in Africa, and they, over the past 5-6 years, they have faced lots of issues in terms of eviction, not enough infrastructure, lots of problems that we would expect slum dwellers to have. That's a good place to kind of read about Map Kibera, what was the strategies, what sort of tools they used. There were a lot of political as well as social problems that Map Kibera raised throughout the project. But one of the important things that I thought was different from other projects is that the slum dwellers actually felt that they were in a way empowered because they actually collected the data. Because the people who ran the project, they trained the slum dwellers, at least like 20-25 people, in the first round of the process. They trained them to use computers. They taught them English. They taught them how to use a GPS device. They managed to get funding, send them fairly decent mobile devices where they can have videos. And at the end of the whole process, one of the really powerful thing which happened was they painted the map on a central location of the slum on a wall, and people could actually come and look at what are the infrastructure situation. And they actually started using these maps for like the election process, the people. And the map was basically like converted to Swahili and like whatever the local language. So I would suggest that that's a good place if you want to like read about how they did that. I don't know this. We can talk a lot about how this thing will be politically, what sort of impacts this will have in terms of eviction, the data going into the wrong hands. But as long as if the slum dwellers feel empowered about it, I would say that's a big win, even if it doesn't actually set up police aid posts or like give them the actual rights that they want. But that's totally my personal view of it. If I had to take a stab on the kind of the tools that we would want to use, Map Kibera was totally done using OpenStreetMap. They had GPS devices. They walked around the streets, collected the data, had interviews with the slum dwellers, asked several questions. What are these infrastructure things? What do you think is lacking in terms of infrastructure in this in the area? And then they put them on a map, which is fairly straightforward. I'm pretty sure Arun is going to talk about a bit of all that in the afternoon session. And if you want to know more about how this whole tool sets chain into each other and how the workflow happens, just find one of us. We'll be happy to talk about that. Yeah, that's pretty much what. I'll leave the Map Kibera project as a way of thinking for all of us to go read about it and see what happened. Yeah.
Might there also be non-map-based ways of approaching this?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought about it, but of course, I guess one of the things coming back to the Map Kibera project is that they started something called the KNN, which is the Kibera News Network, and they started posting videos about violence, about other special events. If someone like doing an art thing in the area, they took a video of that, posted, things like that. So people, and they actually started publishing a newsletter, which is printed and circulated between the slum dwellers. So I think that sort of information kind of empowers them. understanding how large the slum is, how diverse the features are. But I'm not quite sure how that will but it definitely helped them to make their voice count, because this is a large project and there are lots of information about them. People started talking about them. So I'm assuming that kind of translates to some action, because these are people, these are actually existing people, and the slums actually count for at least 10% of population in that area. So that might be one way of doing it, like videos, newsletters, publications, rather than just sticking to maps.
Basic question that should we even be mapping this, or should we be taking on this exercise? I would say yes, we should. The reason is that I think maps are a great tool to understand places, geography, economy, a whole range of things in a very dense visual. And especially if the people themselves, who are residents of this place, map it. Well, history has also shown that those who control the map have controlled the land. It's always been that way, and currently it's always the administration or maps are always a monopoly by certain interests, and it's never been in the public control. So they have always controlled spaces, they have always been doing the plans because they have the information, and we don't. And having a grassroots level mapping thing from the residents themselves, and it's very important that the residents themselves do it. It's not done for them by somebody else, but they themselves do it. That is very important, and that is when the map actually reflects what the people want, because they are doing it for themselves first. And this map, when created, would not only help the administration understand the place better, the people better, but also the rest of the city, the neighboring areas also understand this place better, as well as the local residents themselves understand their area better. Because from my experience, I've noticed that geography literacy is very poor in public. People rarely know what happens in the neighboring wall or how the neighboring property is connected to us. And by this exercise, when people are actually involved in collecting data of a larger area and a collective and collaborating on this, they build a lot of relationships. They actually understand problems which affect them. And they get a bigger picture of how they are connected in a bigger fabric of the city. So this is one reason why I think the mapping exercise is important, and the people themselves do it. They are empowered with the tools. Our role as technologists is to show them what can be done and not do it for them. That you should transfer the knowledge and they should take these tools and use it how they want to do it. It's not going to solve problems, but it will start discussions. It will give, like Sajjad said, it will give them a voice. It actually gives them a platform to show what is their thinking, what their requirements are, and they are faced to the rest of the world. And which is why I think it's important that this is done. And also in a certain manner.
To come back to Nitya's question, well, you can use a map and you can not use a map and decide that depending upon what you want to do or what you want to achieve, right? If the goal is to achieve a kind of a, sense of heightening community level interaction, and whether maps is the best way to do it, maybe not. So what the Map Kibera project ended up doing is they started with maps and understood that that's really not what works for the community there in any case, because they don't want a web-based map to know where to go and buy medicine from. They already know that fact. So they understood that maybe a community radio, a community video radio program is in the best interest of the community. That said, so I don't think there can be a generic answer to that question. It depends upon what you're trying to achieve. In the YUVA case, of course, I'm assuming some parts. I'm trying to understand the problem you're stating. It does seem that you have a governmental map to argue against, right? And that's one of your motivations. In many cases, that might mean that it would be useful to produce a counter map, as you were saying, right? Maybe not necessarily all the time. Say you can say that the government map shows that there are 14 public toilets on this area, and you can if you just give a list of how many of them are actually not in a functional state, even if you do not show them on the map, you can still give a list and in a way can argue in a similar way. So whether a map is necessarily necessary, I think that remains an open question. But even if I assume that you require a map, and going back to what I was saying earlier regarding data and danger of data collection, especially when you're using data to represent a community which is not in a state of self-representation through data already, that they do not, it's not their everyday, it's not part of their everyday living that they use data to negotiate with the state. And you're trying to work as a, as a middleman in that negotiation. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. I'm not, it's not an overall critique of what you're doing. Then I think it's absolutely necessary that you collect as little as data as possible. You give out, especially to the state, as little as data as possible. Because if you have very detailed participatory mapping, height of every building, how many people live there map, and somehow that data goes to a government department, you wouldn't be able to control what that data is used for later on, right? To go back to the problem you were stating, which I think is, so I'm trying to understand again what the problem you were trying to state. It seemed not crowdsourcing of individual houses of these undocumented settlements, but have an overall sense of what all undocumented settlements exist in the city, right? I think that's what you were heading for, right? Okay. In that case, again, possibly speaking very naively, but I think a map-based crowdsource tool just might work, okay? It might become a dead ushahidi like the ones shown by Kaustubh, but there is definitely a possibility there of using ushahidi or any map-based crowdsourcing platform, and ushahidi is one of the most easiest one to set up and use there. I think there's definitely a case to be made there. As most people who has worked with crowdsourcing information would tell you, crowdsourcing information only works when you involve and when you mobilize a large amount of people interested in giving you this information. And I think you know that quite well, so I don't want to give you gyan about that. The question here, of course, is how you design what kind of information you want to collect online, and what information you would want to do yourself by going back, taking the clues from this first information report, right? I think that is something to think about. But even before that, if you ask somebody to report an undocumented settlement in the city, that person needs to have a good sense of what settlements are documented in the city. So the question here is, how do you show people what settlements in the city already exist on the official map? I think that is where the key difficulty in terms of technicality, in terms of data, in terms of everything lies exactly.
Because these spaces will also be contested spaces. So I think it would be important to build consensus within the community as well. And it would be a good way of getting people involved in the process. Okay.
See, it is contestation, as you rightly pointed out. There's a situation of conflict in the city. If we say that the Adivasi community is not there on the map, it's actually a deliberate act. Disempowerment, when we talk of slums getting empowered, it's because they have been disempowered. And disempowerment is a contested territory. So if one wants to actually say empowerment, it means going against the act of disempowerment. And this is a very contested area because, as I think you've rightly pointed out, giving information to the state is part of the contestation. But which information? That is the key element. Like, for example, do you give information of slums to the state, or do you give information about the houses that have not been built? See, slums are a product of housing shortages. And housing shortages are a product of the state not having provided adequate land and housing, even according to their own master plans. Right? So that is the contest. And the state deliberately encourages slums because they don't want to provide that adequate housing.
So Dunu, can you talk a little bit about how you might decide what kind of data in this case? So let's, given this problem, one is what kind of data, and the other thing might be what kind of process do you use to decide what kind of data? So if you could shed some light on it.
Well, two elements which we found very useful. The first element is if there is a community which is not coming on the map, then actually to trace the history of that community in terms of its contribution to the urban economy. And that can be done very easily, not only in terms of their work, but also in terms of their shelter. Like most people who squat on land and build their own housing have invested in that land and in housing. And these figures never come up. We've done studies in slums, for example, which show that each household has, over a period of 12 years, invested 11 lakhs on an average per household in leveling the land, building their house, getting in electricity, getting in water, education for their kids, and all this does not appear on the state's account books. That's one. That is how to empower people, not just by saying where they live, but why they live there. What is their contribution to the urban economy? And the second one is actually you cull out from government documents, from master plans, city development plans, and so on, about what the state was supposed to do and what it has not done in all fields. It was supposed to provide land for housing, land for community centers, land for schools. None of it has been provided. In most cities where we worked, roughly 1/3 of targets have been met, which means if 2/3 of targets are not met, then somebody is doing it. And all those people are illegal because they've done it in spite of the state not doing it. So that is where the contestation lies. And I think therefore, culling out data from one source to strengthen that community and culling out data from another source to, in certain sense, challenge the state that you have not done your job and people have done it. So that's where assertion lies.
BMC uses this argument to say that, okay, the market has taken care of it. So we don't really need to do that. So what do you argue against something like that? I mean...
Excellent. You say, therefore, you can't move off this land. You can't move us out. We will stay here because we've invested in this. This is the market at work.
But then there is another instrument of the SRA.
True. See, that's why all these instruments have to be challenged at a policy level. And that is where I, to some extent, am uncomfortable with this business of empowering one community. Because one community can never get into the policy discussion.
Completely agreed on that. And what we think is a problem in this case is that how to be able to sustain this movement that has happened. And the thing is that in Bombay, what we have noticed is that initially what started as a very elite, very middle-class notion of planning or what the vision of the city should be has now, through YUVA, gone to some extent to some of the urban poor groups. Yet the balance of power vests with, of course, what we want, by asking what tools we can use is so that we can at some level, argue with, alongside them. Because when these guys go to the MCGM even, they say that, what do you have to say? So what should we do? What you just argue about, what you don't have, or that you have not been mapped. That's, yeah.
To just add to the whole debate, I'll just take 1 minute. Mapping or the act of mapping or the importance of mapping right now, which I was asking you guys. So mapping is not the only means that we are adopting. We are doing public meetings, we are taking rallies, we are networking with NGOs, CBOs, with organizations, social work colleges, lots of things. So mapping is just one of the ways that we are hoping that something might work in our favor. Something might. So like the studies that you're saying or policy level recommendations that are happening on the side. It's not that we have just said that we are not dealing with that. It's not like that. We have critiqued on the SRA. We have critiqued on a lot of things. Even we have analyzed the last development plan and said, so much of land was there and they didn't do X and S. But mapping would just be one of the directions we might want to tackle this issue. So that's how basically.
So I think we have been asked to end this session. I want to just thank Sumandro, Sajjad, and Kaustubh for their presentations from earlier and for your participation in this session. And also to Preeti and all the others who have been involved in this discussion. And to Arvind for being so generous in terms of sharing his case and his thoughts on how we can work on this, as a group. So I thought it was pretty fun. Thank you.